I'm Will, and today I'm going to be asking, does the EU cost us money? Over the next few weeks we're going to be looking at the EU referendum debate. We're going to have a few videos. This first one's about finances, the next one will be immigration, and then governance, and finally our Avengers episode where we bring it all together. We're going to look at it all in one go. And this week, since I don't feel like my views are going to turn me into a social pariah, I feel more comfortable talking about them and being a bit more enthusiastic about what I'm saying. There are two main issues I want to talk about today with regards to the economics of Britain staying in or out of the EU. So one of the main things we've been hearing from the Vote Leave campaign is that the UK sends £350 million a week to Brussels, and I want to talk about that right now. Essentially, the £350 million figure is so close to not quite being true that it's kind of a lie. As soon as we send our £350 million a week to Brussels, immediately £100 million, approximately, comes back to us. They don't tell us how to spend that money, that is ours to spend on what we like. Why give the money in the first place if it comes straight back to us for free? Complicated. That brings the cost down to about 250 million, and of that 250 million we get back again about another 120 million. However, this 120 million we are told what to spend it on. About 60% of that money that comes back to us is spent on agriculture and farming within the UK. Now the Vote Leave campaign complains that although we do get that money back, what this issue is really about is decision making and having the ability to choose where that money goes. I am happy to accept that having the power to decide where that money goes is important, but I also feel like the Vote Leave campaign are being very coy about the fact that if we do put that money elsewhere, it will also be taking money away from the farmers who rely on it. If they are arguing that they want to change where that money is going, then they should also admit that they are intending to take that money away from people who do already use it. Or they can decide to agree that actually they're happy with where that money is going, in which case it should not be counted as money that we send to Brussels because it comes back to us. That brings the amount of money that we send to Brussels down to about 120 million a week. Per person, down to about £7.50 a month. That's about your Netflix account. I understand that the numbers we're using are fairly approximate, but they give the main point across. And if you do care about us having control of that money that does come back to us, then at worst it's costing us £15 per person per month, which is more like a Now TV account. So basically my main issue here is that what the Leave campaign is saying is very much not true, really. Now, in many ways, all of this doesn't matter at all. A few weeks ago, the head of the IMF made the comment that if the GDP of the UK drops by just 1%, then the amount of money we save from membership to the EU will be completely outweighed by the loss of money from the economy. I did a quick number crunch. The UK's GDP is about 2 trillion a year. 1% of that is 200 billion. No, it's not. It's 20 billion. By the way, GDP is basically the entire worth of a country's economy. If you accept the 350 million figure, that comes to about £18 billion per year, and so already the 1% drop in GDP outweighs that. However, I've already argued that the UK only actually sends about 250 million a week to the EU, and so that brings our total cost to about 12 billion per year. So a 1% drop of GDP, £20 billion, is about twice that amount. And that's if you don't accept the argument about the money that we get back. That brings the cost down to about £6 billion per year, at which point the 20 billion from a 1% drop in GDP completely outweighs it. It would be terrible if that happened. So the membership fee basically doesn't matter at all anyway. What really matters is how much money the EU makes or costs us in trade. The other point I'd like to make is that people often complain about us subsidising poorer countries within the EU. That money that pays for other countries comes from our membership fee. So if the membership fee doesn't matter, then subsidising other countries doesn't matter. So the question is, will we make more money or lose money from trade deals if we leave the EU? Every member of the EU is part of the EU trade deals, which makes trade cheaper and therefore makes money for those economies. However, the EU does not allow EU members to make trade deals with countries outside the EU. This means that if we left the EU, we would be able to make our own trade deals, and this is a big point of the Vote Leave campaign. So would we get better trade deals if we leave? If we leave the EU, then we will almost inevitably end up making new trade deals with the EU. So the Vote Leave campaign argues that there should be no problem there. However, I cannot see any situation in which the trade deal would improve. At best, our trade deals with the EU will stay as good as they were, but in all probability, they could get worse.
One of the things we haven't talked about yet is the fact that foreign companies come to Britain to trade with the rest of Europe. Now, what happens with that is that Europe has around it essentially trade tariff boundaries. So what foreign companies do is they come to Britain and they bring all of the parts for whatever machines they're making or whatever they're making at all, and they have the factories to put it all together inside countries like Britain, so they get access to the single market with its low trade barriers between nations. By doing that, they're essentially getting past these trade boundaries, and we're benefiting from this because of employment for British workers, for taxes on these products, and they're benefiting as well because they don't have to rely on going through the normal channels.
The Vote Leave campaign also argue that the EU imposes red tape and trading standards which cause businesses to suffer in the UK. If we leave the EU, then the UK businesses will no longer have to stick to EU trading standards unless they trade with the EU. All businesses which want to trade with the EU will still have to stick to their standards. So yes, companies that don't trade with the EU will benefit. However, every other company that does trade with the EU will still have to stick to these standards. Now then, what I would say is the main point here is the UK would of course be able to make new trade deals with other countries which it can't currently do. Let's examine that issue. If we leave the EU, we will have to renew our trade deal with them, which I've already spoken about. However, we'll be able to make new trade deals with other large economies, like, for example, the USA, Brazil and China. Now, the EU is already negotiating a really complicated deal with the USA called the TTIP. If we leave the EU, we lock ourselves out of that deal and we would have to make our own new deal with the USA. And not only would it take time, but we would be making that deal as an economy which is much smaller than the EU. That means we would have less buying power and therefore less leverage to get a good deal. The EU has also recently agreed a deal with Canada which comes into force in 2017, and deals with Australia and New Zealand will soon start going through the pipeline. If we leave, we lock ourselves out of those deals as well. So if we do leave the EU, we could make trade deals with, for example, Brazil and China, two largest economies which we currently don't have trade deals with. Oh, and I forgot to mention India, also a very big economy, and in the issue of fairness, we would also be able to make trade deals with them. But again, smaller economy than the EU and the USA. But what we're really doing is we are giving up our current trade deals with the USA and the EU for trade deals with Brazil and China. The USA is the second biggest economy in the world. The first biggest economy in the world is the European Union. We already have the best possible trade deal with the biggest economy in the world, which is already making a trade deal with the second biggest economy in the world. We want to lock ourselves out of that? Remember, as an economy which is smaller than the EU, any trade deal we get will almost inevitably be less good for us because we're a smaller economy. It's not going to be better. We're not going to get better trade deals by leaving. So I can see no real situation where we would make more money on international trade from leaving the EU because our trade deals will only get worse. With that in mind, I can only imagine that our GDP will go down. So any savings we make from our membership fee, which is far less than the Vote Leave campaign would have you believe, would be completely overshadowed by what it would cost the UK economy. Therefore, from an economic point of view, I see no reason for us to leave the EU. In the next video, Alex is going to be talking about immigration and how that affects the UK. If you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe and share because it will really help us, and that means we can bring you more content. Thanks for watching.